This is Speaker. I am Sandra Shorty. Once again, I'm happy to be with you. I think the film we're about to see is called 9/11 Truth. It features interviews with architects, engineers, scientists, scholars, other professionals, and people who were at the scene.
This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight, and here it is falling through it with a resistance of only 1/3 of its weight. Roughly 90% of the resistance has been removed, and what's happening is the top section is not crushing down the lower section like a pile driver, which is the picture that NIST basically is painting. It's actually falling into material that's already been pulverized. It's offering very little resistance. It's just coming down through pre-pulverized material. One of the fundamental laws of nature is the conservation of energy.
There was no time for this elastic deformation and plastic deformation, which would have absorbed energy and decreased the descent to less than free fall speed. As energy is drained away from the system to deform those members, it would slow down the descending mass and cause a descent at less than free fall speed.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore. I think that should really frighten all of us.
Structural connections not only had to fail nearly simultaneously, but in sequential order.
The buildings fall at a speed which can only occur if the structure has been removed, the vertical structure.
This block accelerates straight down, or is picking up speed downward continually. It doesn't slow down, it just continues to gain speed.
From what I understand, the buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. The core of this building was very heavy. They're huge columns, huge.
I could not see how those massive, very thick columns could just snap like that. I would have expected most of them to stay intact with the floors collapsing around them.
I'm Alfred Lopez. I'm a registered professional structural engineer in the state of Michigan and have been in private practice for 40 years with Lopez Engineering. I've worked on several high-rise projects with office buildings above parking decks and high-rise apartment buildings here in the Detroit area. I've done numerous investigations of failures of buildings because of fire and wind damage. I was shocked at how the buildings collapsed. I would have expected that they would have come down much slower, that they would have tipped over, that the whole thing did not make sense. And ever since then, I had a hard time believing that the fires did drop those buildings.
I thought that given the way the planes hit the building, one side would have given away first and it just would have fallen off or fallen over at a steep angle, but the way the whole thing just gave way at once and started to plummet down without slowing down as it went down. Again, just like the controlled demolition I witnessed personally.
The area below the damage zone where the planes flew in and where the fire was, that area below that, those 80 or 90 stories, 80,000 tons of structural steel was not damaged in any way. Yet you stood there and watched it destroy itself, wiping out floor by floor all 287 structural columns as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
According to the first responders' oral histories, which were reported in the New York Times, over 100 first responders reported sounds of explosions and flashes of light at the onset of destruction of both towers. These were not discussed in the NIST report. What did these eyewitnesses actually see and hear?
We have eyewitness testimony of firemen, policemen, news reporters, and occupants of the building to explosions, an enormous number of eyewitness testimonies.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
Inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was some secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion.
We heard a loud explosion.
At that point, we heard a large boom.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion.
All of a sudden, you hear explosion, and then you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
Then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
as if they were planning to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
One of NIST's other excuses was that there were no blast sounds heard by witnesses or recorded. There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions. There's no doubt they were heard.
In the oral histories of the emergency personnel taken down in late 2001 and early 2002, there are over 100 individuals who make comments about seeing, hearing, and feeling explosions in those buildings. These oral histories were documented well before NIST started their World Trade Center investigation in September 2002. This testimony should have caused the presumption that there was a good chance explosive residue would be found and justified testing for it, rather than the opposite.
Reviewing the some of the eyewitness accounts and people hearing what sounded like explosions and things like that. Again, it didn't seem very plausible for any other type of cause for such an event.
It doesn't look like a collapse. It's like a huge mushrooming, billowing kind of an event. That whole thing looks nothing like a building falling down. It's a building being blown up, and it's being blown up progressively from the top down. That's what the physics shows.
NIST acknowledges in their response to a request for correction that they are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Yet they refuse to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers. And the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress.
The core structure of the building had to have been destroyed by other means.
FEMA documents a 1,200-foot diameter debris field around each tower. Videos show multi-ton steel sections of hundreds of individual steel pieces ejecting out of the towers at 60 miles an hour for a distance of 600 feet. They also show clouds of debris pulverized in mid-air. and isolated explosive ejections as many as 60 stories below the so-called crush zone. Videos also show the near total destruction of both towers. What does all this tell us about the forces and energies involved in the destruction? The spread of debris in a large radius around each tower. What we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint. And this is not expected, and it's not congruent with the reports of our government.
Debris that was shooting out for hundreds of feet in all directions, 70 miles an hour, leaving the 80th floor of the North Tower and making a fairly level trajectory, that to me is fairly alarming.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The number I got was 78 miles an hour. So something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds. And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure, those are what we demolitions guys call squibs. And that's another characteristic that seems to be evident.
Well, in the case of the South Tower, you can see these jets of black smoke being ejected from many locations on many different floors above the level of the impact. There's a whole bunch of these squibs or puffs that are coming out the side of the building. And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows because you have like an accordion effect. It's being compressed. Well, it's going on at a lot of different levels at the same time is one thing. And if you're compressing it out here, if you're blowing out the windows down here, how are you getting the air pressure? I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. I estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The impact of the floors pancaking upon themselves would create gushes of air out the side, but not the kind of explosive force that we saw that would throw I-beams across the street into the windows of other buildings.
The ejection of the materials out of the building, the manner in which it fell, the speed at which it fell, exhibited all the signs of demolitions and the completeness of the destruction down to their individual elements.
When the South Tower was destroyed, at first it looked like it was going to land in the street or take a building out next to it, and then all of a sudden it disappears in this huge cloud of smoke, which didn't seem to make sense at the time.
How can those steel columns, the massive steel columns that they are, supporting that weight of that building, virtually disappear? Why aren't they poking up straight out of that rubble at the bottom of the building?
As an architect, I would expect to see larger portions of the building floors, the decking, the steel decking, the concrete topping, much larger remnants of what the structural components of this building was. There were just small fragments of strewn steel components. There should have been much larger pieces for examination on the ground. After all, there was 110 floors in each building, and each floor plate was over an acre in size.
The fact that it was all reduced to rubble and powder just did not make sense at all.
We have no explanation of how the concrete was pulverized. It takes an enormous amount of energy, way beyond what we have in aviation fuel.
There were two substations on the 108th floor, the 75th floor, and the 41st floor, and the 7th floor. At those 8 locations, there were 4 transformers in each substation that weighed over 30,000 pounds. In the substations on the mechanical floors in each tower. The transformers would not explode on their own. They were air-cooled, dry-type transformers. And yet, after the collapse, there was, as from what was reported, there was no evidence of them being found at the bottom of the towers. I wonder why. It was a shame that after the collapse that a forensic unit forensic engineering unit didn't go into the debris and try to find at that time why the towers had collapsed. I'm sure there was other evidence that could have given a better indication at the time that there was something else wrong.
In its report on World Trade Center 7, which came out in May of 2002, FEMA documents in Appendix C steel that has been melted and even partially evaporated, resembling Swiss cheese. What are we to make of this?
My name is Jeff Fair. I have a PhD in material science and engineering from the University of Minnesota. I have a BA in physics from Brigham Young University. I've worked with solid-state reactions. I've worked characterizing materials, semiconductor materials, thin films. I currently do a lot of work with nanoparticles as well as solid-state reactions. So Jonathan Barnett's study, which I thought was very well done and quite extensive, is all documented by FEMA in Appendix C in their BPAT report that was May of 2002. Unfortunately, it was never used in the NIST report.
My name is Jason Cheshire, and I'm a licensed professional engineer in the province of Ontario in Canada. And I have been working in the field of hydrometallurgy for the past 10 years for a major company here in Canada. And I'd like to know why NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel. Well, why is this not included? Why is this forensic evidence not being included in the report?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
From a volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've worked for about 25 years in industry, and the majority of what I do is analytical work and figuring out what materials are composed of, why they are, why they do what they do. There were sections of them that clearly showed melting. They had sections that were thinned away, and there were actually holes through them, and some of the ends were just melted away or even possibly evaporated away.
I'm Kathy McGrade. I have a bachelor's in metallurgical engineering from New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, which I got in 1979. I then spent the next 30 years with 3 startup companies. In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
We could have filled up the Twin Towers with jet fuel and burned it all up, and that does not cause a fire hot enough to melt structural steel.
My name is Gary Warner. I'm a mechanical engineer. I hold a professional certification from the Association British Columbia. I worked as in the project engineering department of the casting plant of Alcan, the aluminum company of Canada, one of the largest aluminum smelters on the planet at the time. And in that smelter, we turned aluminum oxide into aluminum, molten aluminum. Molten aluminum is silver. It's not yellow, it's silver. It looks like mercury. The yellow molten metal that I saw pouring out of the South Tower is indicative of molten iron. I was a bit incredulous when I learned that NIST claimed that the molten metal was aluminum. I mean, it doesn't look at all like molten aluminum. It looks like iron, molten iron. That's what it looks like. And I've seen tons of it. We used to cast this in Alcan. They still cast it. I spent 2 years casting that.
I'm David Gregg. I have a master's and PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Illinois. Afterwards, I went to work for Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where I worked there for more than 30 years. You cannot get a flame hot enough to start the metal to molten, make it molten in the first place so that this other process takes off. I don't know of any mechanism for that. The only way that's known that a carbonaceous material can cause steel or iron oxide to turn into a molten metal is in a blast furnace. Yeah, and that's very different than what we had.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers.
The next question is how do you get the sulfur in these pieces of steel or in the debris, and that question is unanswered. There's a version of thermite called thermate, which has sulfur in the thermate and what the sulfur does is it's sort of like salt on ice.
Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide.
And it just basically makes the steel melt at a lower temperature. So instead of having to bring the steel up to 1500 centigrade, you can slice through it with material that's at 900 or 1000 degrees centigrade. And if you do a search on Google for thermite and building demolition, you can find all sorts of wonderful devices that have been fabricated and invented that use thermite for building demolitions.
The country owns this. We were all victims. You all should want answers. It's not just ours, not just mine. We all lost something that day.